Happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I want to recognize my co-authors on this paper, and you have a copy of the paper, Maria Navarro and Gary Briers. And they both contributed to the paper at large, and I appreciate that. Thank you for the invitation. And what I would like to do is to break away just a little bit from the paper, which you have, to try to integrate what we've seen today. I think the program has been very exciting today. The Commonwealth of Learning, for an example, and the transformation that's taking place as we speak, and that we may or may not recognize. That's a composite of the paper. And you see in frequencies, quality is very important. Accreditation is also very important. Assurance and trust is very important. Agricultural and learning, very important. And there's a lot of other words there. This is what we intended to do, but what I would like to do is to go pretty much to the middle as quickly as we can to the current status of accreditation. Spend most of our time in terms of analysis and the innovation, and then 7 promising practices on quality assurance, 6 promising practices on accreditation that we believe are something that we should consider, and then 5 promising practices on innovation, and hopefully you will provide the conclusion. So the map from Barcelona to here, I hope that we can make that trip okay. It's a joint effort, and so we came for comparative reasons. When you look back, I think one of the first questions that we might ask is, what is the purpose? That's a critical question for me, and a critical question in terms of curriculum development. It's a critical question in terms of accreditation. What is the purpose? And when we go back to one of the oldest universities that we know of, the University of Bologna, is to bring a group of students together. And it's to provide a forum for research where it can be developed independently and free from political power. Now let's not forget that. What is the purpose? The purpose is for student learning, and the purpose is to provide a forum for research free from intervention. Okay, pretty clear. We believe, like the Bologna process, that globalization, competitiveness, and mobility are going to be major trends for our students. They're going everywhere, they're doing a lot of different things, and they're going to see a lot of different people. Consequently, we also have concurrently 5, I call them megatrends, but these megatrends of population growth, and you're familiar with those. The third point there is that the faculty often don't match the obligations. And so they get caught in the middle. And one of the things that I think we've got to be sure that we can do is position the faculty in a position of strength, not in a position of defense. The last point is expect disruptive innovation. Clayton Christensen talks a lot about that. Well, quality is complex, you know that. Quality is multidimensional, you know that. Quality is difficult to measure. So if we think about those 3 things as a part of our process, we'll be better able to develop instrumentation and charting in terms of our future. Damme, who I don't know, but a European, says that we need to converge on what we actually mean by academic quality. And I think vocabulary is going to be very important in this process. We must use precise vocabulary. I hear precise vocabulary in the science, but not so much in the pedagogy or the methodologies. Okay, it's just a quality assurance framework that looks at teaching, discovery, artistic creativity, integration, and application. That's C.J. Weiser, who was formerly the dean at Oregon State. He goes by Bud Weiser in the university, and we love the way he put that together. He says scholarship is creative intellectual work that's simply validated by you as peers and communicated. So that's the purpose of the framework. And Ernest Boyer preceded that work, and it's in the paper, with some very good work in terms of charting how we might approach quality and accreditation. There's a need for broad international consensus on the core. Now you think about the apple that we had for lunch or the apricot. We need to go to that seed core and see what that common core is. Then several of the pulp around that core may be different depending on the context. Okay, let's recognize the contributions that research makes. We do that very well, I think. I'm not sure the public understands that. Indicators for that are pretty simple and really pretty individual or inside. The Web of Science citation impacts, the niche market research, professional publications that have been talked about this morning, practical products for utility for public good. And I always like to put that last one there because sometimes we get away from what is the public good. So that's quality. What's assurance? Or what is accreditation? Accreditation is simply a root word of trustfulness. It's trustworthiness. 100 years ago in the U.S., they created a process of accreditation which trusted that degree. And at the same time, it branded counterfeit degrees. And that was the purpose of that. The European Bologna system doesn't really use the language, and many of you know that better than I. What we're really doing is just refreshing our memory. But accreditation is not a word that's necessarily used, but the intent is there. Promoting mutual trust, improving transparency, while recognizing the diversity of the various countries that we have that are represented here. The criticism lately is that it does not recognize learning outcomes. It doesn't measure those as much as the critics think should. So it can be argued that the current spread of accreditation is simply a control and compliance. But let's not think of it as control and compliance. Let's think of it in terms of uniform quality and trustworthiness. If we could think of it in that way, we'll see accreditation and quality assurance very differently. Accreditation, Stenstecker said, accreditation is becoming one of the most popular methods for external quality assurance worldwide. Now remember, what we're saying is that quality is an internal process by and large, while accreditation is an external one. But those are not mutually exclusive. Purpose of the U.S. side of that was self-regulation. And so the universities began to self-regulate themselves. And there was confidence. I wasn't there, but in 100 years ago, there was confidence that Oklahoma State, University of Missouri, Texas A&M, Cornell, Wisconsin were all trustworthy institutions that awarded degrees of high quality and were valuable. Today, we've lost some of that. Actually, today we see a loss of that, and in providing private, non-governmental sector with 52 recognized national accreditations and 6 principal. We talk about those regional accreditations in the paper. We won't talk about them today. If we were to come back here a year from now, I would forecast that we will not talk about regional accreditations in the U.S. any longer. And that's been 100 years in the making. And then we've got 75 or so of those specialized. I say ABET as an example of professional accreditation for engineering. 6 core values. What is the purpose? What experiences are necessary to accomplish the purpose? That's the second question that we want to ask. What is the purpose? What experiences are necessary to accomplish the purpose? Well, the core values: integrity, continual quality of improvement, peer review, self-regulation, accountability, student learning, and transparency. That comes out of the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. There's a good bit more to discuss in terms of the values of accreditation, but I believe on both sides of the Atlantic we recognize that trustworthiness of an institution is very important for us, and so we'll just leave it at that. Here's another, in my view, an emerging innovation or disruptive innovation that we should really focus on, and that is this whole private ranking agencies. And so we're proud to say that we're in the top 25 or so world agricultural universities. Cornell in the top, UC Davis, the top institution in the world, Wageningen, one of the top institutions in the world. How do you know that? Because the private institutions said that. U.S. News and World Report, the QS rankings, Times Higher Education, and there's 5 or 6 of those. I would argue we should watch that very closely because the public's watching that and they like the simplicity of the rank. If you look at those carefully, each of those use different criterion for that rank mix. So we need to be sure that what we know is being used as the recipe for the cake. You can make a cake with a given recipe. You leave out several of the ingredients, it won't turn out quite so well. Well, where are we? Then accreditation hinges off of 2 points. I'm a gate guy. So we're going to have 2 gate hinges here. One of those is international competitiveness through integrated policies and programs. Let's not kid ourselves. Bologna, in part, was implemented because it had lost some of the European competitiveness, and the U.S. was drawing a good bit more students. Okay, sometimes the purpose is not the purpose, I say. Okay, and then adjusting those results or adjustments for student mobility, mutual recognition agreements between and among institutions, and new delivery modes. The Commonwealth of Learning. You better watch that because that is a new disruptive innovation. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So there's 3 major concerns that come out of that in terms of where we are, in terms of quality and in terms of accreditation. One of those is accountability. Every paper this morning in the U.S. is talking about the cost of higher education. They're talking about the student debt that's coming out of that, and they're using that as an indicator of quality of teaching. Probably not related directly. Changing structures and delivery of higher education. So we should take innovation by opening up accreditation. Or should we take opening up accreditation to non-college providers? We're seeing a lot of non-educational institutions that are ranking. I asked Maria to stand at the end of 15 minutes, and I don't know if she's thought of it. You know, the other thing is sometimes in an audience like this, you're not sure if people know, I'm not sure that I know if she can hear. And in a presentation just previous to this, I asked Maria, can you hear me? And she said no, and 2 guys down here in the front offered to trade places with her. So I don't know how that's going to work. We'll see. All right. What are we looking at? Let's look at analysis. Several of you are much better at analysis than some of us. So let's really stop and think about this analysis proposal. Bologna has made a change. Don't kid yourself. 1990, 2015. Bologna has made a big change. We still have faculty who do not recognize that change. Accomplishments include degrees and qualifications, but it also includes social dimension, effective outcomes, and employability, which was one of the major outcomes at the Yerevan ministerial meeting 1 month ago, almost 1 month ago today, by the Bologna ministers. lifelong learning and mobility. I've heard you talk about that all day today, and I heard you talk about that yesterday. Thank you, Maria. Know where we are. Two major dilemmas. Man cannot serve two masters. Somewhere we've all read that in some of our literature. But today's education is serving two masters, governments and universities. And so that creates tension. Tension creates stress. Stress creates heat. Heat creates fatigue. So we've got to get rid of all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Okay, here we go. Now we're back across the other side of the water, and there's a substantial agreement for non-governmental accreditation with a minimum amount of political influence in the U.S. It's changing. Senator Lamar Hunt is chairman of the renewal of the Higher Education Act. They've been 18 months trying to get this passed, and they don't have it passed yet. But I will assure you, when it passes, things will change. We used to talk, Ian, about change, and I used to talk, 10 years ago, I would talk about change. Today, we should talk about turbulence. And my metaphor for that is coming across on the airplane into Bologna. The pilot said, please take your seat and fasten your seatbelt. We may experience turbulence. Turbulence and change are very, very different. Change we can forecast. We can build models for change. It's systematic or somewhat. It's predictable. You cannot mathematically predict turbulence. So just think about that, because I would argue that today, with the Commonwealth of Learning, and with several other innovations, we're in turbulence. We cannot predict with great confidence. Three options: refocus on quality, redesign to promote competition and innovation, and keep recognized accrediting agencies independent and free. That's where we are in the U.S. today. And there's a strong argument, and most of that argument is coming from moving accreditation from a self-regulating accrediting body within the university to a more governmental body. Now, it's ironic that on this side of the water, that argument is just the reverse. It's moving from a governmental regulation by the Ministry of Education to a more self-regulating. I think somewhere we'll meet in the middle, hopefully on an island somewhere out there in the Atlantic, and that we can come to some grip on how this whole globalization and competition and mobility can fit together logically. Okay. I love this thing. Just read that. And you heard it this morning, and you heard it yesterday if you were listening. If you can't measure it, you can't do it. If you can't flowchart it, you can't do it. Those are two pretty smart guys up there, actually. I didn't know either one of them, but I like to read what they had to say. If you can measure what you speak, and if you can express it in a number, and then you know something about the subject. But if you can't measure it, and Bill Gates was the one who rang our bell with that, because if you want to do anything with the Gates Foundation, you better be well able to measure that impact. And of course, Edward Deming turned the whole Japanese economy around. I think we ought to watch that. And all that says to me is, let's measure it, and let's get a benchmark reading, and then let's get incremental readings, and let's make sure that we're headed toward our target. Okay, that's quality assurance, that's accreditation. But somewhere in the middle, and I heard this morning, you can't teach innovation. Let's really challenge that idea. But innovation, it's sometimes disruptive. My recommendation, if you haven't read it, is How Stella Saved the Farm. It's a little paperback book. It'll take you one afternoon or one evening to read. How Stella Saved the Farm. VJ and Trimble wrote it, It's the result of about 12 or 13 or 14 years of business all put into a fable, but it's very readable. Once you read that, you've got to read 3 other books that they have. But what you see is that whole concept, there's 6 crucial concepts that go in that. We've got them, they're not in the paper per se, they're in the transparencies that you have. Here's what happens. That product takes root initially by simple applications at the bottom of the market. Guess what MOOCs are? Yeah, that's amazing. And then they relentlessly move up the market, eventually displacing established competitors. Now, VJ and Trimble have watched that for 12 or 15 years in the industry, and I will assure you that it has worked there. It probably will work here. MOOCs, a very low-cost, simple application at the very bottom of the market, but it's going to climb the market. I would bet my dinner on that. Okay. Christensen, and if you read anybody else besides VJ and Trimble, read Clayton Christensen. Harvard, a tremendous thinker, got a great set of videos that will help us with that. But he says that this online education is an emerging disruptive innovation, and he said it presents an opportunity to rethink many of the age-old assumptions about higher education. Clayton Christensen's a pretty smart guy. I think he probably has given us pretty good advice. Now, what he said is, when you take one vector and you drive price down, how expensive is a MOOC? They're free. And you take the second vector and you work against non-consumption. How many applications did we get for admission? 4,000. How many did we admit? 400. How many does that leave as non-consumers? 3,600. That's a disruptive innovation in the making. Because unless we satisfy that non-consumption, then we're going to have real turbulence. And we can point in 2 or 3 directions and show you where that's already happened. Okay, there's going to be huge changes when that happens in economic growth and competition and technology, and you ask the public, and that's what they're looking for. Okay, how are we doing, Maria? Let's do six promising practices for quality. We learned in Iraq, don't make recommendations, but let's talk about promising practices. Okay, they may work in your context, and they just might not. Okay, curriculum is the guidebook. That's a promising practice. I would say it's a recommendation. I could tell you a whole bunch of war stories. David and I could tell you about trying to transform a Soviet institute into a Bologna process. They wanted a guidebook. Some of you know what they meant by that. But this guidebook is the fundamental framework for innovation. Student learning is our driving force, but quality is the defining element. Student learning and quality teaching are inextricably linked and interdependent. Now, is it Asha? This morning, I listened carefully to your presentation, and I didn't hear you say teacher, but I heard you say course, and I heard you say curriculum, and I heard you say program. That's the teacher in the online process from a non-face-to-face intervention. So curriculum has to be a promising practice, and unless we reinvent or innovate curriculum, we're always going to be talking about what it might be, not what it is. Ultimately, 4 assessment criteria explain priorities. Academic scholarship in the landmark teaching, research, and service. Demands of the subject matter, you heard some of that just a few minutes ago. And relevance to society and viability. And we're using viability instead of sustainability, and they're using it in a little different way, and the paper talks about it a little bit. Okay, there's 3 more. It's peer evaluation, rigorous research, student evaluation. We've got to listen to that student in terms of what is relevant and what is rigorous. And they want both of those. The professor who says they don't want rigorous programs is kidding himself. Improvement, communication, and innovation are the primary drivers across faculty. Motivation and control have less impact. So we're not going to control this thing. It's got too much horsepower. The greatest challenge in future quality is a balance between continuity and change, and synergy between internal and external while meeting the obligations of public trust. And I think if I had to choose one of those out of those 7, that would be the one. Okay, how much time? 5, good. 4. There's 6 promising practices on accreditation. It's a bond affirming trust. If I can't trust you and you can't trust me, we can't do business. So it's as simple as that. And we've got a lot of examples of how that can work. It delineates standards both qualitatively and quantitatively. They're measured and they have boundaries on them. Because we can't do all things, but we can do something. The policies for accreditation recognizing internal and external standards, providing student protection, very important, providing independently verified information, and improving and enhancing quality. There's 3 more. It's designed for the fitness of the institution and the culture. That's the reason one size will not fit all in accreditation, either in Bologna or in the U.S. I think that's real important because I think we're trying to head towards a one size fits all. And when that happens, you have one shoe size, we all have a different size foot. It'll be uncomfortable. Institutional accreditation should be free of political influence. It should absolutely be responsible to stakeholders. And it should fit in a national qualified not a national set of qualifications. Okay. Now here's 5 promising practices for innovation. It's critical. You got to measure it, and you've got to measure it in the long term. Because just like much of our plant science research, you can't plant it one day and go dig it up the next day and say that it wasn't viable. You've got to give it time to mature. And that's what I like about Finland. That's what I like about Singapore. They've turned their whole institutional infrastructure around, but it took them 10 years to do that. And they were committed to that without giving up before it actually bloomed. Faculty reward system has got to match the academic function. VJ and Trimble say there's 6 concepts. We won't have time to do that, but they're in the paper. And that technology, including online learning, well positioned to be a disruptive innovation. Well, we're living in turbulent times, that's for sure. We no longer are in fast change, we're in turbulence. And Peter Drucker, one of my other favorite guys, says, greatest danger is not the turbulence, but it's to act with yesterday's logic on the turbulence. So when you fasten your seatbelt going back across the Atlantic, don't worry too much about the turbulence. But we should not use yesterday's logic to think about that. You can expect disruptive innovation that's already happened in a lot of places, particularly with the Commonwealth of Learning. And learning and innovation go hand in hand, and both of them can be taught. Norman Borlaug told us when we got ready to deploy on post-conflict development, we were asking his advice, and he said, and I say to you, be bold. Thank you very much. Yes?
I think the most rating research achievement. This ranking is based on research achievements. I think the university should transfer this kind of research achievement or research rankings to the teaching experience. That's very important. We're not sitting here saying this ranking nonsense. No, they are objective.
They are objective. Yes, they are.
So my point is, what's your opinion? How to transfer this kind of research achievement or rankings to the teaching experience?
He's asking you, by the way, so, you know, be okay. I would like to think about that. I really would, and I do. And what we've got to do is to use measurable criteria with boundaries. Once we establish those, then we can use various stakeholder rankings. If you'll look at those 6 public rankings, they all use different criterion, okay? So some of that is peer ranking. I think the University of Georgia is a great institution, so I'll rank it high, okay? Hey, yeah, but at the same time, I may not be as objective as I should be, so we need to be sure that we have the correct criteria. No, I think it's something that we need to explore, but I don't think that it's something that we need to ignore. Yeah. These are 14 characteristics of high-performing universities. I know this is going to sound a little bit strange for you, but I believe that you can think yourself into a new way. I believe you can act yourself into a new way of thinking easier than you can think yourself into a new way of acting. I think for most of us, if we emulated these top 14 high-performing university traits, student development, stakeholders, technologies, library facilities, resources, and begin to act like that, that we would make progress. Yeah. Sorry. I get. Thank you very much.
Okay.